So in today's society, there's a lot of anger and I would say hatred toward white people, with a big focus on the slavery of black people in America, 150 plus years ago. So one thing that people may not be aware of is that ever since the Revolutionary War, there was a huge amount of people, abolitionists, white abolitionists, who wanted to get rid of slavery. So even George Washington, who owned slaves, spoke out against slavery. He wouldn't split up slave families. He wouldn't sell off slaves and separate them. He wouldn't harm them. He didn't allow his people to harm them or hurt them. But he did kind of shrink away from actually releasing his slaves. So an interesting thing is he had one of his favorite people during the Revolutionary War was a young French guy named Lafayette, who was staunchly against slavery. So this young man always talked to George Washington about slavery and how much he abhorred it. And George Washington always agreed with him, told him, yes, I absolutely agree. I just don't know how to get rid of it. And I don't know how to continue my own work, as a plantation in the South without it. So he always supported it verbally, but then kind of shrunk away from actually taking action with it. But Lafayette and other people were very, very staunch advocates of the removal of slavery back in the late 1700s. And there was actually, many thousands of slaves who were freed during that time. They fought in the Revolutionary War and were awarded their freedom. Even some of Washington's slaves. Lafayette bought a big sugar plantation, down in the Caribbean somewhere, I believe it was, and worked abolishing slavery on his plantation, and started paying the workers who pretty much mostly stayed and worked and continued doing what they were doing, but getting paid. So, one thing, I just think it's unfair to be so angry or hateful toward white people when there was a massive amount of people between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War that were constantly advocating for it, getting laws changed, making it possible for black people to be free, and to have everything that they had, right? Of course, slavery, ever since the Revolutionary War, it kind of plummeted, and much fewer people owned slaves than ever before. And over the years between that and the Civil War, slavery was not this massive thing that was countrywide. So if anybody believes that, it's wrong. I would highly advise learning about the years between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and what happened with slavery and who the advocates were. I mean, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of powerful white people who were staunchly against it and worked to get us to the place where then they would fight to the death to end it. Okay, it was a slow burn over almost 100 years. All right, it wasn't like just suddenly in 1860, Lincoln said, well, let's abolish slavery, and everyone in the North was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go fight and die for it. Okay, it was a slow thing over almost 100 years, right? That people who were against it built upon that since the Revolutionary War and got more and more people to join with them, and there was a lot of humanity there. A lot of powerful white people who had slaves agreed, got rid of it, freed their slaves, many of which chose to stay with them because they had treated them well, even though they were slaves. They were been treated well, and that's where they were comfortable. And then they ended up getting paid and making money and building homes and families and all that. So when you go about hating on white people today for slavery, I just ask that you consider all of the people, the white people, who advocated for the destruction of slavery and who died to stop it. We are of one race. And there were people in the past who didn't acknowledge that. But there were also many thousands of people in the past who did. And they fought and they died to stop it. So please don't dishonor them. Right? Please don't dishonor them. They deserve a place in history as heroic people. And even at a time when racism was, I mean, black people weren't even considered humans. They were considered property. Think about the young white man saying to a bunch of slave owners or people who think that black people are subhuman, slavery is wrong. And you shouldn't be a part of it. You should end it. It's not morally right or ethically right in any way, shape, or form. Think about that young man saying that and the bravery and the courage that it took to do that. And that without them, without somebody being brave enough to do that, slavery may not have ended when it did. It could have continued on for a very long time. It could be now. If it wasn't for those people like Lafayette, like I believe Alexander Hamilton, I believe even he was an abolitionist. And I know, what was it, John Lawrence was another one of George Washington's right-hand guys. He actually argued to free slaves so that they could fight in the Revolutionary War. And he was an abolitionist. So, once again, before you just knee-jerk start hating on white people because of something that was very ugly and very, very long ago, think about the people who fought to end it, the people, the courage it took, the bravery it took to do that, and the sacrifice that they made to make it happen. I admire George Washington a great deal, and the one thing that that I'm a little disappointed in, but everybody's disappointing too, in some way, shape, or form. But I mean, I have to admit that it's a little disappointing that he didn't take action on slavery, even though he acknowledged that it was morally incorrect, and that he hoped it would be absolved someday. But he was in a very good position to help that along a lot sooner than it did, and I wish he had done that. So I think for all of his glamour and glory and for all of his strengths, he did have a weakness, and that was a weakness for sure. And everybody has weaknesses. So, I'm not going to condemn him, all right, because we're all human. All the people of the past were human. They were flawed, and having grace with that is important, And I give him props for being for being a man that stood, like he inherited slaves. He grew up with slaves. He inherited slaves. It's the only thing they knew, And before he was their master, they could face very harsh punishments. They were split up and sold. Their children were sold off at like 12 years old to go and work on plantations elsewhere and stuff. And he said, no, ain't happening. That was a very good first step in treating slaves as the humans they were, and setting the groundwork for acknowledging the humanity of slaves and releasing them and having them be equal in our society. And we can't ignore that either. He barred his overseers from hurting them, taking physical and harsh disciplinary action. He demanded that they be treated well. And he even said that, if a slave runs away and is caught, that forgiving them and having grace with them was important. Not beating them, not harming them, but forgiveness and grace. He said this, and if they did something wrong, if they stole or something like that, he was disappointed and he would show disappointment. But he would never harm them. He showed them grace and love. Right? That was acknowledging their humanity. right? Setting the groundwork. And I mean, it's huge that he didn't split up slave families. That's huge because they all did that. And it was horrible. And he saw that as the horrible thing it was and refused to do it, even though he could have profited from it greatly. When he was bleeding money, he was bleeding money. And he was also, funding, in a lot of ways, the Revolutionary War as much as he could. And he still wouldn't separate slaves and sell off family members. That says something. It really does. Because he could have, and many did. Many had no compunction about it, but he did. So, we can't just paint history with a broad brush. We can't paint anybody in history with a broad brush. And we can't condemn them for one thing without acknowledging the things that we should honor. So anyway, just some perspective on the race relations of today because of the race relations of the past. We're all humans. We all need to acknowledge each other's humanity, but we also need to acknowledge each other's flaws, shortcomings, and that we all have them. You have them. I have them. Everybody has them. Should we be condemned for our flaws? Or should there be grace, kindness, love, dignity, respect? I think we'd be in a much better place if we could manage that. So I love and respect you, even though I don't know you. I honor your accomplishments. I honor the good parts of you. But I also hope that your shortcomings are something you can acknowledge, recognize, work on, and do better always. That's a goal of mine. That's something I'm handing down to my children. Always do better. You're never there yet. You haven't crossed a finish line in your own development. Let's all do better together, and our society won't end up in a bloodbath like it has in the past. Because that's my fear right now, is that our society is heading toward another horrendous bloodbath based on ignorance, anger, fear, all the negative things that humans can portray. Let's all do better together. Let's move forward from here. This is a really good place to move forward from. There's so much opportunity. There's so much enlightenment. There's so much information, knowledge at your fingertips. Download an Audible book or two about how our country got to the Civil War. Learn a lot before you talk. That would be my best advice. Especially before you take some really strong stand on any issue. Learn a lot before you open your mouth. Be willing to listen before you talk. But let's all do better.